Hi, folks. My name's Evan Smith, pastor at Second Presbyterian Church here in downtown Stanton, and I thank you for joining us for the midweek home worship Bible study. Today, we're looking at a passage from Acts chapter 2. In particular, we're looking at verses 42 through 46, which are all about this idea of fellowship and community and what it is that the early Christians did together. And as we think about these ideas of fellowship and community, I'm actually reminded of how individualistic our society typically is. We exalt the individual. We are all about the rights of the individual, often over the rights of the community. And yet we're seeing that being tested now as we're in this period of social isolation, and people are choosing to give up what should be individual rights for the sake of the group, for the sake of the weakest and the most vulnerable among us, though we are starting to see a bit of pushback on that. And it reminded me of this quote from John Donne that you may have heard. John Donne wrote, "No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manner of thy friends or of thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. It tolls for thee." That, like I said, it's a classic passage that maybe you've heard before, and yet I'm also reminded of the words of Simon and Garfunkel, who sang, "I am a rock, I am an island." So yes, we have this, I think, this budding tension a lot of times between what I want to do and the common good, the common collective. And in this time when we are, like I said, socially isolating and we're pulling ourselves back and we're trying to be mindful of others, it is good to study this particular passage. As I said, it's Acts chapter 2, verses 42. I had said through 46, but it's actually through 47. Listen now to this word. They, that is the early Christians, devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. All came upon everyone because many wonders and signs were being done by the apostles. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. Day by day they spent much time together in the temple. They broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the goodwill of all the people. And day by day, the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. It's a great passage. It really, really is. It is a classic passage. And there, the Acts 2 verses 42, that seems to be the one that people focus on most. And it says, they, the early Christians, devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to prayers, to breaking of bread, that's meals together, communion, and fellowship. Like that was the cornerstone on which the early church was built. so let's look at this and let's think about, like, if this is what the early church did, then there's something that it has to say to us, some ways that we can glean, like these are still the essential parts about being the church. So the apostles' teaching, that's what became the New Testament, just the word of God. And so we should still be dedicating ourselves to the teachings of the Bible. Like, there's a lot of ways that we are able to grow in faith. Bible study is not the only one. In fact, my entire doctoral project, of which several of you were a part, was all about spiritual disciplines and ways that we can grow apart from Bible study. It wasn't just about apart, but it was. There were different paths that were apart from Bible study. But even still, Bible study, the Word of God, that's what grounds us. That's what lets us know what truth is. That's kind of like our north, our true north on our compass. Like by that, everything else is measured. So we have to do that. Now, the thing is, there's a lot of that we can and should do completely on our own. And so that doesn't change. And so even in our time of social isolation now, you can absolutely and absolutely should be studying the Bible on your own. Next, prayer. Prayer is definitely something that we do by ourselves. Like, you absolutely should be saying prayers by ourselves, but by yourself. But there is a power of praying with someone else. Like, if you can get over the awkwardness of it and the fact that, like, I've known folks who don't want to pray out loud because they feel like their prayers are being judged. Like, oh, I'm not as good of a prayer as someone else. And it's like, I get that. And I'm someone, I've never actually thought I had great out loud prayers myself. But I always encourage people the best way to learn how to pray in front of others is just to pray out loud on your own. And you'll sort of see that, in the end, if I stutter a little bit, if I stumble over my words, trip over my words, you know what? So be it. God understands your heart. And so there is a power of praying together, but there's also like something that we also have to pray by ourselves. Like there's no doubt about it. The next thing, breaking of bread. That's an interesting one because that's communion. I gotta tell you, I never would have imagined a time when I would be leading a communion service online with a little bit of cheese, which I use as my bread because it was a tortilla like wrapper made out of cheese, and some wine. But that's what Monday, Thursday, that's what I did. I encourage you to do that. I heard from one person that she took communion with a muffin and coffee, and I celebrate that. God bless you. God bless that. I love it. Like whatever it is we had, and that was our way of breaking bread together. I know of one church who's doing a really interesting thing where they were wanting to like continue to have fellowship meals together. So they had this enormous Zoom call, and people set up their computers at their table, and they all sit with the meal that they prepare on their own, and they just talk to one another as they eat. And is it as good as being around the table together? I'm sure it's not. Like, how could it be? But daggum, are they not hitting on something that like there's a power to eating together? There really is. There's something that's special about that. That's actually why the Jews in the Old Testament, they had what they would talk about as table fellowship. And you could only have table fellowship with certain people. To have table fellowship with someone, to sit and eat with someone, meant that you guys were equals and that you condoned their lifestyle and that they were like clean and everything else. That's why it's such a big deal actually in the book of Galatians when Peter will not sit with Gentiles. When other Jews come around, he won't sit with the Gentiles and have table fellowship with them. And Paul calls him to account for this. And so there's some sort of power in eating together. During the year I spent in Kenya, I saw that come up time and time again because they are a more communal-based culture than we are. And so you'd be in like the food court of a mall. And yes, I lived in Nairobi, so there was a mall and there was a food court area. And sometimes at lunchtime, there just weren't enough tables for everyone. So even though, in America, if you're sitting at a table by yourself and like that whole table, even if there are 4 seats, even if there are 8 seats, it's your table. Even if you're by yourself, that's your table. No one's going to sit with you. But it wasn't that way in Kenya. And there were multiple times, and the first few took me some getting used to, but there are multiple times that I'm sitting expecting the whole table to be my own, and someone else, because they needed a seat, would just sit and start eating. Now, they wouldn't speak most of the time. They wouldn't introduce themselves. It was just this thing like, I need a spot to eat. You need a spot to eat. So we're doing this together. And yet it created this odd dynamic. Like we're eating together. We don't know one another. Table fellowship is very important. And for the early church, that was a big part of what they were doing as well. They're breaking bread, having communion, eating together. And then the last ones, they dedicated themselves to fellowship. That word fellowship in the Greek is koinonia. And anytime you see the word church in the New Testament, it's almost always this word fellowship, koinonia. That's what it meant to be the church, was to have fellowship, to be together, to support one another, that interconnectedness, that koinonia. And it actually has roots in this idea of a marketplace and a gathering together there. Not as far as like a selling of wares, but the idea of the way that people would come together in the marketplace and you would see people. Like, you go out to Walmart, or back in the day, you'd go out to Walmart and you'd run into somebody and you'd talk to them for a few minutes before moving on. Well, imagine being in a small community and at a place also where like you didn't have preservatives in your food. You have to shop like every day, every other day. And you're just constantly running into people. And there's that buzz, that energy about the place. You can kind of imagine that was koinonia, that fellowship time together. One of the great ironies of our time in this passage is that I know for a fact I've preached on it twice, two different messages, and both times I talked about how online virtual worship is not going to be enough to cut it. That we always will need to be able to gather together, and that there's always going to be something missing from just trying to do things online. That there's a lot we can do online, a lot that it's great for, but in order to be the church, we had to meet as the church. And so that's obviously a little ironic right now because we can't meet as the church. We can't get together, and yet we're still challenged to be the church. Yeah, that's where we're at. We can't get together. And so some people, they're so upset about this that they're wanting to return back to church. And what I fear, quite frankly, would be too early, especially since a lot of churches are comprised of those most vulnerable groups, the elderly, the ones who most suffer if they do get COVID-19. And so I think we're still at this point where we have to be willing to say, you know what, meeting is important and it always will be, but we need to find good ways to do it that are safe and that we're not putting people in a place where they feel like their faith is going to be questioned if they choose to stay home in order to remain healthy. And yet, how do we figure out what it is to be the church in the midst of that? Because the truth is, we as a species, we need people. Like, we go nuts if we have too much time on our own. You know, the classic sci-fi series, The Twilight Zone, the pilot episode of it from the 1960s actually explored this idea of what it would be like if you were in a town where there was no one around. And I'm going to show you a few clips from that I've inserted here.
Of imagination.
Get him out of there. Help me, quick. Help me, help me. Release the subject on the double.
Be careful, Colonel. Don't cut his hand. The glass on the clock is broken.
I can see that, Sergeant.
Sergeant.
All right, Colonel, go. He's all right, sir. Delusions, I think. He's coming out of it now.
Fine. Did you get all the data recorded?
Yes, sir, every bit of it. Did you get a timing on him?
484 hours, 36 minutes.
Good. I want to have a look at all the data as soon as it's compiled, and I want to see the reaction chart on him, too.
Yes, sir.
Oh, the press, sir.
Oh, yes. On the run, gentlemen, if you don't mind, I want to see Sergeant Ferris.
Do you consider this a success, sir?
Very much so. The man was confined alone in a box for something in the neighborhood of 484 hours. That's roughly equivalent to a trip to the moon, several orbits, and return.
And this was a simulated trip to the moon, is that right, General?
For all intent and purpose, yes.
What about these wires attached to him?
Electrodes. All of his reactions were charted and graphed. Respiration, heart action, blood pressure.
What happened to him toward the end, General, before he pushed that button or whatever it was?
What happened to him is that he cracked. Delusions of some kind, we assume. But let me tell you all something, gentlemen. If any one of you were confined in a box 5 feet square for 2.5 weeks, all by your lonesome without hearing a human voice other than your own, I'll give you especially good odds that your imagination would run away with you too. Such as his obviously did. Excuse me. Detail? How do you feel, sir?
I feel much better, sir. I'm sorry about toward the end.
All right.
What was it like, Ferris? What did you think you were?
A place I don't want to go again, sir. A town. A town without people, without anybody. What was the matter with me, Doc? Just off my rocker, huh?
Just a kind of a nightmare that your mind manufactured for you. You see, we can feed the stomach with concentrates. We can supply microfilm for reading, recreation, even movies of a sort. We can pump oxygen in and waste material out. But there's one thing we can't simulate. That's a very basic need. Man's hunger for companionship. The barrier of loneliness. That's one thing we haven't licked yet.
Next time it won't be just a box and a hanger, will it?
No, Mike. Next time you'll really be alone.
And that was the craziness of it. That guy, he was a part of this like project to try to see like how do people handle social isolation as we're contemplating sending a man to the moon. And they just saw that after an amount of time, his mind broke. You know that like this is actually a thing. If you spend too much time alone, your mind will create a friend for you. Your mind will actually create someone with whom you can interact because we have that great of a need for fellowship. We see that. There's this really neat little video that I'm going to show you in a little bit, all about the Tom Hanks movie Castaway and why it is that Tom Hanks created a friend in the volleyball Wilson, and why it is that when we watch this clip, when we watch this movie, we're actually involved emotionally with Wilson. And when Wilson eventually is lost at sea, our hearts break. I've known people who cried at the scene of Wilson the volleyball being swept out to sea. And so check out this video that this guy put together to explain why it is we care so much about Wilson.
I was watching the movie Castaway recently, which is the story of a man who gets washed up on a beautiful but completely deserted island after a plane crash. The story is a moving and sometimes inspirational tale of one man's survival against nature. Somewhere near the end of the second act, this happens.
Wilson!
And just like anyone who watches this movie, I felt genuine sadness for Chuck as the music score swelled and his volleyball bobbed and floated away from his desperate hands. And then I thought, how the hell did that happen? How did a movie almost make me cry because a volleyball floated away? To understand why we care about Wilson, we have to understand how he became a character. Human beings are very social creatures and we crave social contact. When that contact is denied, we'll invent it by using inanimate objects. This is called anthropomorphosis. We give these items names and characteristics, just like a real person, and we'll even attribute emotions to them, and in extreme cases, we'll imagine how they'll respond. Repeated studies have shown that the lonelier the person is, the more likely they are to anthropomorphisize, and the stronger that attachment will be. This explains why Chuck creates Wilson, and partially explains why he's so attached to him. It takes a while for Chuck to become lonely enough to need Wilson, but after a few days alone on the island, he gets pretty mad, injures his hand and throws the volleyball in frustration, giving birth to Wilson. While a normal person looks and sees a volleyball with blood on it, a desperate and lonely person sees a face, a friend. Once Wilson has been created, Chuck begins to speak to him like a real person. He starts to imagine his responses and even has arguments with him. But even though Chuck speaks to Wilson as though he's another character, he's actually an extension of himself. Though he doesn't realise it, Wilson is an externalization of his own internal critical process. Rather than simply being an imaginary person, he's a projection of his own personality. Wilson is the part of Chuck's personality that was a dissenting voice. He contained fear and doubt, but he was also the problem-solving part of his personality. The ball even starts to mirror the same physical changes that Chuck goes through. Over time it becomes weathered, tan, thinner, and with a tuft of hair poking out the top. Just like Chuck. It's a real turning point in the movie for Chuck when Wilson is born. Up until that point, it had been nothing but frustration for Chuck as multiple ideas failed over and over. But almost immediately after Wilson is born, Chuck begins to find success. Having a physical object to bounce ideas off not only seemed to alleviate the pressure from him, it also allowed him to think critically, instead of the unplanned emotional responses that he'd been relying on up until that point. In short, Wilson is the reason that Chuck is alive. By the time Chuck decides to leave the island, he's aware on some level that he needs Wilson to be able to think critically and challenge his own ideas. Chuck also recognises the stabilising effect that Wilson has on his emotional well-being. We learned that after 3 years on the island, Chuck had tried to end his own life by hanging himself from a tree high on a cliff, but had been talked out of it by Wilson. Although Wilson is the voice of dissent to Chuck, he also represents hope. Each time Chuck felt like giving up, he was encouraged to carry on by Wilson, first with the fire, then with the suicide attempt, and again later when he doesn't have enough rope to complete his raft. Wilson tells him he can use the rope from the failed suicide, an idea that Chuck is resistant to, but Wilson pushes him to collect it anyway, and ultimately, without that rope, Chuck would never have escaped. In the same kind of way that Chuck anthropomorphizes a volleyball into Wilson because he's completely alone, we do something similar. We have no characters besides Chuck to connect to. So like him, we spend almost an entire movie in isolation, with no dialogue for small chunks of it. The creation of Wilson reduces that isolation, and unconsciously, we begin to think of Wilson as part of Chuck. We spend the largest portion of the movie connecting with Chuck, feeling all of his failures and celebrating his successes. I'm not ashamed to say that I felt connected to both Chuck and Wilson, and one without the other felt like an incomplete character. When Chuck wakes up, after being battered by the storm, with no food, and a raft which is now just a couple of pieces of broken wood, and sees that Wilson is missing, he panics. He dives into the water and swims after him, and the moment when he realises that he has to let Wilson go is a sad and difficult moment, because we're not just watching a volleyball or a friend floating away. What we're watching float away is hope.
Wilson! And he's just crying on the raft at that end scene. It gets to you. Why? Because we need people. That's how God has made us. And so in this time of social isolation, we're figuring out how to do that. I think we need to continue to do as much virtually and online as we absolutely can. I mean, I'm trying to keep daily content with the devotionals, midweek content, Sunday content, exploring all these different ways for us to connect. Last Sunday, we had a really great actual live worship service where people were able to comment and you could see things live, and it felt good, didn't it? Just to be people are saying hello and we know we're there. And I think that's so important. That's so important. We need to keep doing that for sure. But we also still have to remember that the church is the place that we need, because it's a place that's greater than ourselves. The church is greater than our whims or our preferences. And that's why sometimes we have to put up with prayers we don't like, or sermons we don't like, or songs we don't like, because it's not designed around us. It's designed around our community and what's good for the community. It's also the place, church that is, fellowship, koinonia, that are the training grounds for growing in holiness. Holiness might best be defined, of course, as to be set apart, to be like Jesus. That's what holiness is. And we measure that in a lot of ways by those 9 fruits of the Spirit that Paul talks about: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And if you are trying to grow in holiness, the best way is to focus on growing in those 9 fruits of the Spirit. And the church, it's the training ground for us to grow in that. It's a safe place for us to learn to practice love. It's a safe place for us to learn to practice forgiveness. Have you ever noticed how the church is so often filled with people that might kind of annoy you, or someone that's, just says the wrong thing, or just whatever else it is? Why? I think God does that on purpose so that we can learn to forgive in a safe confines of place where we're all trying to learn how to forgive. And we can learn how to love by learning to love on difficult people. So then other folks seem so much easier. And we do this in the safe confines of the church so that when we're out of the church in the real mission field of the world, we're able to do it. The church is always going to have a special place. The church is always going to be this unique thing that we need. And maybe you, like me, you're missing your church. I still remember Leatrice Gibson, that every time I would visit her, the message she would always want to pass on, this was after she was at Legacy, was, "I miss my church." And she'd say it just like that, just so emphatically, "I miss my church." Earl and Jean Flower would say a similar thing. They'd always talk about, we miss it there. And there's nothing quite like being able to be at church. And we're seeing that now. And so when the time comes that we're able to come back together, I get the enthusiasm, and I'm going to be enthusiastic too, but we have to be safe. We have to be safe. And in the meantime, we continue to dedicate ourselves to the Word of God, the Apostles' teaching. We dedicate ourselves to prayer, dedicate ourselves to the breaking of bread. And maybe we should do like a little dinner church kind of thing where we set up our phones or our computers and we just sit around on a large Zoom call and eat together and talk as best we can. Or maybe we just have a time of communion like that. As the communion service was earlier. And we focus on this time of fellowship. These are the cornerstones, the bedrock of what made the early church grow. And they held all things in common. They had the admiration of the people, and the Lord added to their number those who were being saved daily. I think that should be our hope too. So, this is your Bible study for midweek worship. I hope it's given you something to think about. I'll include some other questions for reflection. And let's all continue. Bible study, prayer, breaking of bread, fellowship. 4 key corners of a solid spiritual foundation then, they are now. Thanks a lot. Have a great day. Bye.